This is the Do-It-Yourself Guide to Business Buying. Today we're talking about resolving final issues. Welcome, business buyers. What is our goal with this video, resolving final issues? Well, to keep it short, I'm going to list 14 developing issues that can potentially derail your deal at the last minute or just before closing. And they crop up often enough for us to note and discuss. Because the counterintuitive reality is SMB deals are very vulnerable just before closing. They need to be actively managed leading up to closing. I mean, the heavy lifting is completed and closing seems like it should be a formality. But in many deals, nothing could be further from the truth. So here are 14 things that can potentially derail the closing of your deal. Number one, the business is not really for sale. In this scenario, we have a non-active spouse who wants to sell, but the active spouse does not. This is a family business dynamic. So the active spouse merely is going through the motions to keep the peace and has no real interest in selling the business. Let me show you what I mean. Let's introduce a little pedestal here called "We Are Selling the Business." And we want all of the owners of the business on that podium. Let's say it's a family business. There's a wife who's the non-active owner. There's a husband who's the active owner. It could be reversed. We deal with a lot of baby boomers, and in the baby boomer scenario, it very often is the wife who is non-active or barely active and the husband who is active. So we have a non-active owner, the wife, who wants to sell the business. Could be you don't want to be chained to one location anymore, want to travel, want to enjoy the grandchildren. Maybe they have to move. There could be family illness, any number of reasons. And we have the husband or the active owner who doesn't really want to sell, but after a couple years of convincing, finally reluctantly agrees to. But even though at face value, he says he wants to sell the business, in reality, his heart's not really into it. He doesn't really want to sell the business. This is a very common scenario. I've had it play out in my own deals at least 3 or 4 times. I've seen it happen to other people many times as well. And in the end, this deal is unlikely to close because the business is not really for sale. So make sure that you have a real finger on the pulse when it comes to these family businesses. Sometimes it works the other way. This time the active spouse wants to sell, but the non-active spouse does not. And that non-active spouse is sometimes completely in the background, but at the same time has real veto power over the sale. How does it work? Well, again, we've got the wife who's non-active, the husband that's active. This time the husband, hey, I've had enough. I want to go. I'm working hard. Burnt out, decides wants to sell the business. The non-active owner, the wife, and in one case in particular that I'm thinking of here, did not want to sell the business at all. She finally was talked into entertaining some offers, but again, her heart wasn't in it. She was a 50-50 owner, but she wasn't really active in the business. She did not want to sell that business. What was the end result? Yeah, exactly the same. This deal is unlikely to close, and in the one I'm thinking of, it did not close because the business was not really for sale. So marital dynamics are super important in these family businesses. You do need alignment on this issue. You need both husband and wife on that podium. We are selling the business. We want them unambiguously to agree that they're selling the business. And if you're going to invest a lot of time and effort into working a deal, you definitely want to have your finger on the pulse. Number 3, sometimes we have hidden influencers who aren't family members that have veto power over the deal. Now, it's sometimes hard to identify the people who have this hidden veto power, but you need to make an effort. I mean, it could be an uncle, a friend, maybe a golf buddy. First-time sellers can be quite insecure when they're selling their business. They're always worried they're being played in some way. And so if all of a sudden somebody they respect is giving them that exact message, they can be quite vulnerable and they can be influenced by that individual. So our job is to try and figure out who these hidden influencers with veto power might be and manage the situation ahead of time. So it's definitely worth thinking about when you're dealing with some of these small businesses and you've got a first-time seller, and you have to ask yourself, is this person being influenced by somebody not transparent to me? Number 4, lawyers who want to renegotiate the agreement. We've touched on this already. SMB lawyers acting for the seller feel like they have an obligation to that seller to improve whatever offer the seller has already accepted. And then they start this one-sided, unilateral renegotiation that changes the basic fundamental agreement that you've already negotiated. So you need a strategy to deal with this issue. I like to reinforce with the seller that the business agreement is completed, and now we're taking a look at the lawyer translating that business agreement into the legal agreement. I like to talk about it in 2 parts. right? There's a business agreement and a legal agreement. We're not talking about the business agreement anymore. We're only talking about the legal agreement. And sure, there can be some issues in terms of the language you use in the legal agreement to capture what we've already agreed to in the business agreement, but that's really all we're doing. Any concessions requested will require an equal offset concession in exchange. Number 5, sellers that nibble away at the price. Very common. Experienced sellers never stop asking for more as long as they keep getting it. So if you're brand new to this, never give concessions at this point that aren't equally matched with an offset. Don't have the mentality or mindset that, oh, if we just concede on this one last thing, that'll put it to bed, we can move to closing. That's not really the way it works. As long as you keep giving in response to them asking, they'll never stop asking. So eventually you have to say no, and obviously sooner is better than later. Number 6, deal fever destroys your negotiation range. Deal fever in a competitive situation can be a huge disaster. What is deal fever? It's just making decisions based upon emotion rather than reason and analysis. And if deal fever starts to dominate this particular deal, you might still close, but it's going to be at a price that destroys the economics of the deal. And I'm going to have more to say about deal fever at the end of this presentation. Number 7, you can expect a late demand for a personal guarantee on the seller note. That's right. Expect a late request for you to personally guarantee the seller note. Even if you've already negotiated this issue, it's really common for lawyers and hidden influencers at the end to tell the seller they need a personal guarantee from you. So you've got to stress why the security package that you have in place will protect them. And again, this is not something that you're open to renegotiating. It's already been negotiated. Number 8, unknown regulatory or compliance issues. It could be a regulation, an ownership restriction, licenses, a professional of record that's needed, compliance type issues. Just beware of gaps that are too difficult to eliminate prior to closing. These issues come up and cause a last-minute delay. That can often be insurmountable. So you need to be ahead of these regulatory and compliance issues. Number 9, key employees leaving the business. Small businesses often depend on key people staying to transfer value to the new owner. I mean, businesses can survive employee turnover, but they don't always maintain their value when key employees are gone. So you got to be on the watch for that. Not necessarily key employees that have left, but that are planning to leave as well, because that transfer of value to you is super important and it's hard to do if the key people aren't there. Number 10, unresolved liabilities or legal issues. These are legal loose ends, lawsuit exposures, disputes over intellectual property, warranty claims, just stuff that's outstanding on the legal side. This is difficult to manage. You need legal due diligence that's robust to pick these issues up. And again, you want to try and stay ahead of them. But if you have a couple of major ones, yeah, it's going to be a problem. Number 11, fixed assets and receivables are overvalued. The closing payment falls short because the borrowing capacity has been overestimated. Why? Because the seller provided you with asset values that were inflated. Remember, very often we're dealing with compiled statements, so no professional accountant has offered opinion on the value of those assets and whether they should be impaired or not. We assume the assets are worth X amount of dollars. When it gets time to try and borrow against those to come up with the closing payment, we fall well short because the seller just inflated those asset values. So that does come up at the last minute sometimes as well. Number 12, market conditions change significantly. I mean, market conditions drive the cash flow forecast that impact the residual value. And so if you have a major negative movement in market conditions, it's going to affect the price. Problem is, price adjustments are difficult to implement in response to changing market conditions. I mean, sellers are very reluctant, but at the same time, we have to face the facts that if there's a major negative market move, it does affect value. And we have to make the painful decision to reopen those negotiations in response to those negative market conditions. And you have to be open to walking away in that situation. Because yes, it's great to close a deal, but if it's at a price that you can't make any money at, buyer's remorse is just going to dominate you post-closing. And so we do want to avoid that. Number 13, just the value transfer is not there. We talked a little bit about this already. But the business valuation might be on point, but the ability to transfer that value becomes doubtful for any number of reasons. Very often, it's all about the seller's personal goodwill and whether the value of the business is dependent upon personal goodwill or just business goodwill. Of course, the seller's position is always that it's business goodwill, but sometimes towards the end, we figure out that no, actually, the personal goodwill of the seller is really important in this deal. And so we're going to have a problem transferring value. It's one of the most difficult things for a buyer to walk away from, but it's something that we do need to do. If you can't transfer value, you don't want to buy the business. You need to differentiate the value of the business from the value of the business that can be transferred to you as a new owner. And so, keep your finger on the pulse of value transfer, also super important. Number 14 is just a straight out falling out between the buyer and the seller. Emotions are heightened for a seller in the last phase of selling a business. Maintaining rapport and a strong bond with the seller is critical in this phase. I mean, relationships can dissolve over trivialities. The buyers are overconfident. They think everything's been done. Now we can just coast this thing home. No, don't have that attitude. You got to be talking to the seller all the time in those last couple of weeks. You've got to take active steps to deal with any issues and maintain the rapport and the bond, because those relationships can dissolve because of the heightened emotion. So be careful about that. 2 last points to make just to wrap up. I want to explore the deal fever mindset a little bit more and talk about the reluctant seller persona. Let's start with deal fever mindset. It's all about emotions and emotions driving decision making. And if that happens, and a little bit of it is inevitable, but if it goes too far, we're talking about deal fever. Very, very common in business buying. Of course, the antidote to deal fever is reason, analysis, emotional detachment. Really important to make decisions divorced from emotion when you're buying businesses. So be on the lookout for that. Deal fever is an occupational hazard in business buying, not just in $1 million businesses, but $500 million businesses too. So let's avoid deal fever. Let's avoid making decisions based upon emotion. All right, that's the deal fever mindset. Let's talk a little bit about the reluctant buyer persona. What's that all about? Hey, if you're a cash buyer, you're a reluctant buyer, kind of by definition. Why? Because it's a good negotiating posture. You want to discourage aggressive negotiating from the seller. And so one of the ways we do that is by taking the negotiating posture of being a reluctant buyer. It does get a little bit more complicated if our offer includes a large seller note. We have to be a little bit more nuanced. We want to show excitement about the business because we have to show confidence that we can pay the seller note, but we want to be reluctant over price. So for financing with a seller note, I take a look at the target code and kind of break it into 2 pieces, separating the business from the price, and always maintaining enthusiasm about the business and about the prospects and our ability to be able to do well owning that business. If there's a seller note involved, we don't want to be business reluctant, although we can be price reluctant. We just always want a seller to believe that we are paying more than we want to pay. Remember Warren Buffett's playbook in the initial video on this series on pre-planning? They want to buy a good business at a fair price. Well, sometimes we twist it. And it's a situation where we are overemphasized on the buying the business part and downplaying the fair price part. And that's a mistake that we want to avoid. It is one of the greatest causes of buyer's remorse. Deal fever gets the best of us. We're so focused on buying the business that we let the fair price part of it get away from us. Our next video is the final one, closing the deal. Let's get after it. This is the Do-It-Yourself Guide to Business Buying. Today, we've been talking about resolving final issues. We want to learn and grow as we go. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.